Hi, everyone. I'm Kaylee, a bookseller at Women and Children First. We are one of just a few feminist bookstores left, and we're so thankful you're spending an evening with us to celebrate Sara Flannery Murphy's Girl 1. Tonight, she will be in conversation with Amy Gentry. We begin our virtual events the same as we begin our events in store with a land acknowledgement. Please join me in acknowledging the land on which the bookstore stands is the occupied unceded territory of the Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux people. We encourage you to learn more about land acknowledgements and about the rightful owners of the land where you are viewing tonight's event. A few logistics. In just a few, I'll introduce Sara and Amy for reading, then conversation and questions. If you'd like to ask a question, there's an Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And if we can keep those there instead of the chat, it makes it wonderfully easy to find them. There's also a handy Buy the Book button at the bottom of the screen that will link to the Women and Children First website. So thank you for that. The event will run about an hour. And then for our introductions, Amy Gentry is the author of Good Is Gone, a New York Times notable book, and Last Woman Standing. She is also a book reviewer and essayist whose work has appeared in numerous outlets, including the Chicago Tribune, Salon, Paris Review, the Austin Chronicle. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Chicago and lives in Austin, Texas. And Sara Flannery Murphy is the author of The Possessions and Girl 1. She grew up in Arkansas, studied library science in British Columbia, and received her MFA in creative writing at Washington University in St. Louis. She now lives in Utah with her husband and their 2 sons. Thank you both for joining us, and everyone else, enjoy the event.
Thank you, Kaylee, and Women and Children First. Hi, everyone. Sara, I'm so happy to be here with you today. This is a book that really got me excited, both when I first learned about it and then when I read it, and it like turned into something completely unexpected for me and kind of blew my mind. So I'm really honored to be asked to have this cool conversation about it with you tonight. I'm wondering if you would like to just start with reading a little bit from the book, and maybe you could just kind of give us a little bit of setup beforehand about Girl 1.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to read from the beginning, so minimal setup is required, but the book in general is an alternate timeline. In 1971, a controversial scientist was able to induce Parthenogenesis, otherwise known as virgin birth, meaning that the eggs fertilized on their own, which is otherwise impossible in human beings, in 9 human women. This drew all kinds of interest until it ended in tragedy. Josephine Morrow, otherwise known as Girl 1, who is the oldest of these 9 so-called miracle babies, is now in her 20s pursuing a career in the sciences herself when she learns that her mother has gone missing, which is where I will pick up my reading. I learned about my mother's disappearance from the evening news. I looked up from my textbook when I overheard my surname and recognized the exact cypress tree that grew outside my bedroom window. From that point on, my life turned into a stream of simple equations. How long my mother had been missing? 1 day. How long since I'd had an actual conversation with her? Just over a year. The cost of a bus ticket back to Coeur d'Alene, my adopted hometown, $15. The amount left in my bank account after spending $15, $110.67. How doomed I would be if I abandoned Chicago for longer than 3 nights. Very. I had 4 exams looming within the next few weeks. For a while, I lost myself in these calculations and the illusion of stability they offered. This was my standard coping mechanism: turn everything into problems on a checklist to be neatly solved, then filed away. If I pulled it off just right, I could focus on the question of how many pairs of jeans to pack, 3, and keep my growing panic at bay. But when I arrived back in Coeur d'Alene, Illinois, heart of the lake with no lake and no discernible heart, I stood in front of the shell of my childhood home in the balmy twilight, and everything in me crumpled. Something bad had happened here. Something bad had happened again, and this time it involved my mother. The footage on the news and the photos in the papers hadn't prepared me. The wreaths of yellow caution tape around the porch railings looked weirdly festive. like an interrupted birthday party. The porch still stood, but a narrow gash through the living room wall exposed blackened brick, hanging guts of insulation, snaky wires. The rest of the house looked more or less the same. That was almost worse, the untouched parts. I took a deep, shuddering breath. Now I'm going to bounce ahead just a page and a half to Josie talking a little bit about her very strange origin story. Each year of my life revolved around two particular dates. An emotional arc as fixed in my head as the rotation of the Earth around the sun. The first came on April 24th, the anniversary of one of the most controversial scientific breakthroughs in the 20th century, my birthday, a date that had become a question in Trivial Pursuit and the title of a little-known song by The Clash. The second date landed in June, the anniversary of the fire that had taken everything from me. Together, those two formed the simple punchline of my origin story. It might have been birth that put us on the map, but it was death that kept us there. Since first grade, I could recite my personal history on command and often did for anybody who'd listen. In the year 1970, the shiny start of a new decade, a visionary named Joseph Bellinger put out the call for young women to become part of a risky reproductive experiment. Between 1971 and 1975, 9 women gave birth to baby girls. There were no fathers, not genetically, not biologically, only eggs dividing impossibly. The 9 of us, swiftly dubbed the Miracle Babies, launched Bellinger from crackpot obscurity to global fame. For 6 bright years, there were photo shoots, interviews, limited edition baby dolls, conference presentations, sponsorships, endless editorials. Bellinger stayed with us at the Homestead as much as possible, doing his best to protect us from both the shine of the spotlight and the inevitable darkness that collected at its edges. By my 6th birthday, the darkness started to overwhelm the shine. The people who opposed our very existence got louder, more aggressive. Our most prominent critic was a man named Ricky Peters, a preacher whose fame grew alongside ours. But Ricky wasn't the only one. Politicians publicly promised that, if elected, they'd make Parthenogenesis illegal. Ministers and priests took to the pulpits to remind the world that we were born pre-damned, petri dish abominations, our eternal souls only half formed when we were conceived without fathers. In 1977, everything fell apart, one disaster after another. Lillian, Mother 9, the last to give birth, was the first to die. She left her 2-year-old daughter, Fiona, orphaned in every sense of the word. Doctors around the globe snagged TV appearances and front page spots to argue that Bellinger's methods were clearly dangerous, illicit, and untested. Some mothers fled the Homestead, taking their miracle babies with them. Our makeshift family fractured and scattered until barely any of us were left. And then the fire.
Thank you. That is a great place to end on a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
So there's so much I love about this book. I just wanted to start out by telling you congratulations. It's just the writing, as you can hear from listening to Sara read it, is just impeccable. It's gorgeously written, and it lulls you in the first half. In that first part that she's reading, it starts with, almost to me, it felt like a very noirish kind of present, a narrow kind of storyline with just her and her mom, this one special relationship in the fallout of all of this past events. And then it just opens out as it goes on in a way that I kind of felt like wasn't not even twists, but just like it just kept expanding, and my brain had to catch up every time. And I just felt by the end of the book, I felt so like I had learned something and also really felt something. So yeah, congratulations. So Parthenogenesis. Let's talk about the premise of the book. Why this scientific experiment, and when did this idea come to you?
This idea came to me a while back, longer even than the idea for the possessions. It was almost like one of those ideas that sticks to you and you're like, well, I'll get rid of it by writing another book. But like, then you finish the other book and you publish the other book, and this idea is still just like hanging in your brain, like waiting for you to notice. I got the idea when I was attending a course called The History of the Body as part of my MFA program. It wasn't a writing related class, but it ended up being incredibly rich for my imagination. It covered like just how we related to our own bodies all throughout history, through diet, through fashion, through religion, and of course through like reproduction, which was when I began to realize that the history of reproduction has had like a lot of ups and downs, and that it has not always been something that's been cleanly understood. Like the birds and the bees is a very contemporary understanding, like to be alive in a world where any like second grader kind of has a general idea of what's going on. And it was so mysterious to people. And I feel that a lot of the people researching reproduction came to this idea wondering, how was like the father the most important part of this process? Because it would have been very, very disruptive to allow like the mother, like the person with the uterus, the person giving birth, that much significance.
Yeah.
And I ran into this idea, which I freely admit I may have misinterpreted in some ways, but I remember like sitting in this library. I remember stumbling across this line about how the father basically imbues the child with humanity. Like the mother provides the form and, incubates the form, but the father is the one who provides like the soul, the intellect, like just the humanity of the child. And that if a woman kind of got above her station a bit or was thinking too independently, she could self-conceive, but without a father to, hand over your soul and your humanity, you are sort of soulless. You're sort of a monster. And I first toyed with the idea of it like through a very gothic, like fairy tale lens, and through the idea of monsters, because this would have been like 2007 or 2008. And I was just like monster crazy during that time. I remember like really loving the movie Ginger Snaps.
Yes. God, that's such a good movie.
Really good. And it was the first time I'd seen werewolves as like a more feminine story, because I love werewolf narratives, but they're usually men. Yeah. And this time it was through the lens of like, I think adolescent girls. I haven't seen it in a while. And I was like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. I was reading.
They change with the moon. Like it's the moon that changes them every month. Yeah, totally.
I know. So it was like, I was just like, wow, of course, like this could be an amazing origin story. And it evolved over like, gosh, the decades now, I guess, like 15 years, until it turned into more of a superhero origin story. Although I still feel like the echo of that original, like monstrous kind of, the origin story that focused more on monsters is still very much inside the DNA of the book.
Yeah, so to speak, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I appreciated most about the book, because I went in and I was like, oh, this is a mystery with some kind of alt history component. And then I was like, oh, this is just straight science fiction. This is a science fiction book. Okay. And then as it went on, I was like, well, wait a minute, this is about superheroes. No, it's magic, and I found myself kind of shifting between these paradigms. And I felt that if you had approached it, I love monsters too. And I love like, women as monsters and sort of, and the history of reproduction as this, like trying to find a way to control this very scary technology that only women have, or at least, people with ovaries have, and uteruses. And so anyway, as I think if you had approached it from the Ginger Snaps angle, I would have been like right on board, but I would have known right away though, like what was happening. And I think something about approaching it through that lens of science, it seemed so researched. I was really impressed, and I wondered, I'll ask you for your next question if you want, but how much of the science you looked into, because it felt so, without being like real, it felt like I was not always sure if maybe you were citing a real source at some point in the science. And then, so the other stuff's kind of took me by surprise. And by the time it started feeling like something more mystical, I don't know, it just had such a big impact on me. I felt like the layers are really evident in the book. And so is the fact that you had been mulling it for so long that it kind of developed its own form. So yeah, how did you go about doing research for this book beyond this class once it started to develop?
I was very intimidated to approach it. I think one of the reasons I wanted to bring it into more of a fairy tale realm was because the idea of approaching anything with a scientific basis, it really scared me, because that, I've always kind of pigeonholed myself as someone who's not going to be able to understand that. I'm so much more of a humanities bookworm. And actually, in earlier drafts of the book, I tried very hard to make Josie not interested in the sciences herself, which never worked at all. And eventually I just had to say, you know what, I have to write a character who's interested in the sciences. And, I just have to take on that mindset and hopefully do it justice. Thankfully, there are some precedents for virgin birth in humans. There was a search for a real virgin birth back in, I want to say the 50s. In the UK, there was a call for anyone who might have been a virgin birth, any parent who thought they might have given birth to a child via Parthenogenesis, to come forward. And there is this section pretty early in the book. I think it's when Josie is meeting her first lost sort of sister. And she's thinking back on the testing that they went through under public scrutiny when she was little. And those were based on reality. They used serology tests, and the skin graft was the ultimate test, and it ended up not working. And that was why the last pair standing that they still considered to be possibly a virgin birth, mother and daughter, they were because skin graft didn't work. And I'm in this one, but
cutting up just a little bit. I just want to kind of let you know you're cutting up just a little bit. I think you're okay, but maybe if you have anything else to close in the background, that might help a little bit. But I think I heard what you said. But maybe rewind 15 seconds of that. The skin graft you were talking about is the test that the last known investigation into parthenogenesis, and it kind of failed the skin graft test, right? And that's it. Can you explain for the people who haven't read the book, what that test is?
Yeah, so they basically took a small amount of skin from the mother and the daughter and grafted it onto, they grafted the daughter's skin onto the mother and the mother's skin onto the daughter, because the idea was that if the daughter is really a product of parthenogenesis, her DNA will be so identical to her mother's that there wouldn't be any of the usual issues you have with skin grafts from donors, where your body will reject it because it's foreign DNA. Basically, your body, the daughter's body, would recognize the mother's DNA, the mother's skin, as her own, which is kind of lovely and poetic and a little creepy too, which is my favorite intersection of poetic but kind of morbid. So yeah, it was really nice to be able to draw on these real world experiments that people had actually performed to try to see if this was possible among humans. To my knowledge, I don't think we have any recorded incidents of it, but the world is mysterious, so you never know.
Yeah. I think it's a couple of things about that, one, I think the connection between mother and daughter, and this is also, I think of this also as a book kind of obliquely about motherhood. It's about bonds between women in general, but you have these 9 pairs that are just called mother 1 and daughter 1, mother 2 and daughter 2. And part of the structure, the way the book is structured, she's almost collecting, she's going to at least make an attempt to find each of these, her sisters and aunts, I guess, who from this commune, to try to find her mom. So, I don't know. When you were writing it, were you thinking about metaphors of motherhood, or, does that closeness, that idea of being a carbon copy of your mother appeal to you or terrify you, or both?
That is a really good question. I want to say both. It definitely shifts and changes over the years, I found, because, as a teenager, I think it would have been incredibly upsetting to me because that's like the time maybe when you're trying to separate from your mother a little bit more and assert yourself and say, like, this is who I am versus my mother, which I wanted to kind of explore with Josie and Margaret, because Josie is not always like the biggest fan of her mother, doesn't always see her mother as like an active and interesting part of her own life, even though she has this incredibly unique relationship with her mother. But I feel like a lot of us can kind of relate to this very generally, the way like you can sometimes suddenly like look in the, like more and more, I feel like I will just look in the mirror and realize how much I look like my mom. Which I don't know if that's because I'm like aging and I'm catching up to the age she would have been when I was a child, or if I'm just better able to see it now. But like, it's a moment that's like, kind of touching and also a little bit uncanny to like see somebody else so clearly in yourself.
Yeah.
And especially someone like your mom, who, you can have like a very intense relationship with. I feel like even the people with the very best mother-child relationships still have some real intensity going on there, almost by design. So yeah, I did think a lot of the mother-daughter relationship. I don't think I realized quite how much I thought of my own mother-daughter relationship until I started talking more about the book, and was just like kind of realizing how many actual moments from my own relationship with my mother ended up in this book despite its premise. I really love I love writing fiction because I love having those layers between myself and the story, and I like being able to explore other worlds, explore other identities, kind of. Or not really necessarily other worlds, because all my books have been grounded in this world, but explore like other timelines, other realities, other lives that I could have lived. But I think I had to step back and realize, like, wait a minute, I did draw quite a lot on my own mother-daughter relationship.
Yeah, it's about, Josie is searching for her mom. She's estranged from her mom, though, right? And even though she's, genetically identical to her mom, she doesn't really know anything about her mom's life, and which makes it hard when she actually starts to, look for her. And also, she has this other kind of shadow relationship in the book with her father, which is like, can you talk a little bit about Bellinger, the scientist character, and his relationship with Josie?
Yeah, that was a very complicated relationship to draw, because I kind of went into it knowing that Josie would rethink some of it, but I wanted her love of Bellinger to really feel authentic and really feel true. I'm lucky to have a good relationship with my own dad, but I mean, and Bellinger isn't really Josie's father. She just kind of sees him that way.
Yeah, why does she see him that way, do you think? Because I didn't think that was obvious that you would. But Josie is really fixated on this idea that she's his daughter in like a meaningful sense. And I was totally fascinated by that. And I wondered like where that came from in that character.
I think in part I was basing it a little bit on the way that we can give fathers in general more of an easy time than mothers. I feel like we can be quite critical of mothers, and a big brunt of like the mother-child relationship can involve like so much caretaking, so much like having to say no or having to do sort of boring necessary things in order to protect a child, that they end up in this role that can feel like something you outgrow, or something that's more sort of stuck. And I feel like father relationships, like father-child relationships in literature even are like presented as a little more like renegade and a little more wild and fun. And they're like kind of these cool figures who are able to come in and inspire you. So I really wanted to play around with that a lot, like the idea that she could be literally born without a father and have these sort of father issues anyway. I read about Louise Brown, who was the first person successfully born of an IVF procedure, not very long ago, actually, just in 1978.
I'm glad you said not very long, because that's my birth. That's when I was born. So
yeah, well, it's not
like
it's
basically yesterday.
Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah, it does feel super recent, especially considering how wildly weird it was. Like it was so disruptive, and people found it so scary and bizarre at the time. And now it's like, you know, we don't blink an eye. It's incredibly commonplace, and nobody is saying the things about children born of IVF that we kind of suspected about Louise Brown. Like, yeah.
What did people say about her when she was, I mean, were there similar things said about her at the time?
Yeah, there were at least a few people who said that she had like supernatural powers, which is kind of hilarious, but great. People were pretty angry. I know that her family suffered a little bit from people, you know, stalking them or sending them like bloody test tubes in the mail. Like, they weren't always happy about this, which is funny because IVF hews pretty closely to a more traditional model. You know, she had like a biological father, a biological mother. Like, it's not that much of a change from like the more traditional, I guess, vision of parenthood. But even just in that one way that it was disrupted by medical technology, people were just panicking about it. Like it seems like it made people rethink her very humanity. Mm-hmm. And
do you think it comes back to that idea about the soul and like the father's role, and like, you know, that reproduction has to be this like, you know, very heteronormative thing that in which like a patriarch kind of injects the soul into like a fleshly woman, like I'm into a vessel, because you also talk about you talk about vessels a lot in this book. But like, do you think there is it really was kind of this idea that by disrupting it, you know, this was like kind of a monstrous Frankenstein type birth?
I don't know if people would have described it in exactly those words, but it feels like even thousands of years later, that's kind of what happened, was that we see any kind of change in reproduction, which is such like a kind of basic, intimate part of our lives, like this question of how we literally get here, that if we shake it up, or if it seems like we're, you know, playing God, which I think was a big concern, that like we were overstepping our bounds and like science was going too far and taking over the role of like what God had deemed appropriate, which is an attitude I really don't enjoy. That it took away some of Louise Brown's humanity and may have made her like this demon child. It was fascinating to see that, like to see those attitudes still lingering so I mean thousands of years after that theory that I encountered.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, though. I feel like it's basically kind of still in the air, you know. I mean, I think anything that gives women more power over their reproductive capacity, and you know, when you do or don't have kids, and how you do it, and with whom, is like, you know, that's also potentially profoundly disruptive to a kind of natural order where men are in charge, right?
Oh yeah, I think. Yeah, there was so much of that in the attitude towards Louise Brown, and it really struck me reading her autobiography that the doctor who oversaw this, whose name. I cannot remember. I remember Louise Brown's name, and I cannot remember his, even though he was
Good.
like, I think
Yay,
he was
Louise Brown.
I know. Yeah, it's kind of fitting. But yeah, just that he was so focused on as like the center of this. And I do realize that by all accounts that I've read, I don't know, I could look him up a little more. By all accounts I've read, he was actually a fine person. Like, he clearly kind of pioneered this medical breakthrough that really has helped and been a very positive thing for a lot of families and for women in the ensuing years. But I was frustrated by the way that Louise Brown's mother was not really seen as having that same importance in what went on. Because I was like, for her, she went through quite a lot very publicly. Yeah. Like, she was putting her faith in a procedure that had not been, it hadn't been successful yet at that point. And I think that she was kind of at the verges of the story. And there's a part later on in Louise Brown's autobiography where I can't remember if she says it herself or if I think she's quoting something about how the doctor who oversaw this was like thanking the women for their like patience or something. And that was what triggered there's a section in my book, like I think it's like a Time interview, like on Mother's Day, where I kind of wound that idea in, which was very fun to write, where Bellinger is sort of like thanking like Margaret Morrow, who is like Mother One, the first woman to conceive via Parthenogenesis, is like thanking her for her patience and being, just being very like benevolent and generous and like saying, people should remember you as well, like with a little pat on the head.
Yeah, that's so funny. I love all those interviews, and I love the like kind of the fragments of the coverage from the time. I think those are so fun and clever and also like infuriating. And for the first part of the book, that's kind of where Bellinger's voice comes from. Because he also died in this fire. We learn at the beginning of the book that he is no longer around. So maybe part of why Josie is so infatuated with him is because, she didn't really get to know him after a certain age, right? And so she kind of clings to his legacy and becomes like this almost spokesperson. So she's the one who like, not the only one, but she, she's going on to become a scientist. She's going to follow in his footsteps. And so she's happy to talk about that in public. But yeah, anyway, her, without like giving any spoilers about the book, but this idea that the women involved were these like passive vessels and that they just sat around, even if anyone today or went through yourself any kind of like IVF or fertility treatments, like everyone knows people who've been through that. And even now, it's not parthenogenesis, but even now it's like not a small thing, it's not like, just pop a pill or whatever. It's like, actually, it's a lot more than patience. So yeah, that idea, I love that idea in the book, how it shows up that the women's roles maybe turn out to be a little bit more active than we are led to believe.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point about Al Bellinger. He's not a part of her life. And so I think that she is able to look at him through through like heart-shaped glasses and just see only his good points, especially since although he was controversial, he was also considered such an amazing person and had all this like kind of glory and attention. So he's like the kind of parental figure who's not actually there. And her mother is, and her mother like has to, take care of the day to day, which is often unglamorous and often thankless and, has all kinds of conflicts that like Bellinger as like her like father figure who's not around anymore is able to just kind of avoid. And that plays a lot into her adoration of him and her desire to like follow in his footsteps, since she's not able to recognize at first that her mother's footsteps have gone in very interesting directions as well.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. I feel like if the second I start talking about that, I'm gonna be spoiler central. So I don't want to go there. But it's just so great. I just love the progress over the book. Her arc of like very slowly learning things about her mom and being like, oh, maybe, you know, she's been on a path to becoming exceptional that is totally directed through her relationship with her like absent father. And, you know, by the end, she's kind of seen a new path to being exceptional. And it's like just so exciting. Like okay, so I read when I read this, I couldn't help thinking of shows like Buffy, especially season 7 Buffy, even the movie The Craft, and X-Men and all these other influences, and Frankenstein, of course. I mean, there were just so many points of reference that I felt like really informed this book. And I was wondering if there were, you know, we've heard about the research component and how that sparked the idea, but if there were specific literary or cultural influences, you know, that you were conscious of drawing on.
I mean, I loved The Graft when I was younger and continue to love it. So I think that idea of women young women like coming together and finding this sisterhood and magical powers at the same time, or like supernatural abilities at the same time. The women in Girl One, it hopefully works out a bit better for them in some ways than in The Craft, because I feel like in The Craft there is more of a question of like, you know, do some people go too far with that power and is it corrupting? And in Girl One, I did want to sort of explore the girls being able to bring out better sides of themselves through these, you know, as they meet each other, it kind of almost triggers these abilities in each other. I also really love Geek Love by Catherine Dunn, which is, you know, so the idea of like weird reproduction and these parents who are like looking for something different from their children. I don't know that that's like a really, really direct influence on it, but that was a book that I read as a 20-something, and it was so wonderful that I held on to it. And I think it kind of crept into different things that I wrote. I think The Power by Naomi Alderman was just amazing. I read it as I was just starting to write Girl One. And I think sometimes when you're just starting out on a project, especially if it's a project that's a little more unusual or like genre bending, and you can't always look to other models for it, and you can kind of get in your head like wondering, how do I tell this? Like, is anybody going to want this? Like, how is it going to look on the page? And then you encounter books that do some of the things that you really want to do. Like, that's such a comforting feeling, and really inspiring, I guess. So it was it was like wonderful timing that it came out just as I was finally moving beyond publishing my debut and felt like psychologically able to write something else. So those were some of the really big ones, I would say.
Did you feel pressured to write in something similar to your first book? Because this is a pretty, you know, it's a pretty big departure genre-wise.
You know, I didn't feel too pressured. I think my agent, when I first talked to her about the idea, she felt that it was kind of similar because it was grounded in reality, but had like a speculative element. So in some ways, I feel like they do kind of relate to each other a little bit, although they do take on much different subject matter and I feel like much different tones. Somebody said that like Girl One had some gothic undertones, which made me like incredibly happy because I would love to bring a little gothiness to everything I do or everything I write, but it's definitely not as overt in this as it was in the Possessions.
I guess there are a few very gothic scenes. There's like one in particular in the beginning when she early on, that you probably know what I'm talking about. And then also there's a character later, one of the girls who ends up being kind of a bigger character in the book, who I loved, this character who's like actually a little spooky. I was thinking about her as the craft girl, you know, because I was like, and I really liked the feeling of, I think it feels dangerous, even though it's kind of a weirdly uplifting book. Like I felt at the end of Girl One, I felt really uplifted in a way, and yet at the same time, it's like it's dark it's like a dark action thriller for, you know, much of it, and definitely the second half is like, you know, full of very scary, like, and part of it's because you never really know as a reader. Again, I feel like the plot is so pacey, and there's like several mysteries that are kind of going in tandem with some action, but you don't ever quite, like, you're very good at keeping the reader a little bit off guard about exactly what's going to turn up next in this world. And also, let's not forget, it's a historical world too, so they don't have cell phones.
Right. Yeah.
How did you decide to set it in the past? Because you could have done this conceivably. It's Parthenogenesis. It hasn't been discovered yet. You could have set it in like 2025 pretty easily, right?
Yeah, yeah. I feel like in the 70s, people were actually interested a little bit in like virgin birth. It was kind of niche. Like, I always feel very shy talking about it because I've only been able to find like very vague mentions of it. So I'm always like, well, maybe the women who are involved in this like don't want to be talked about as much. So I try to be like respectful of that. But in the 70s, there were women who got together and were very, very interested and really seemed to have a very profound and genuine belief that they could figure out virgin birth.
I had no idea.
Yeah, I know, it's very, very underground. Like, it's very niche. I know that there may have been I want to say like a magazine, although it would have been more like a zine, you know, like very, very, like very grassroots, which I have never seen a copy of. I think that would have been amazing. So part of why I wanted to set it in the 70s was because it felt like it played into something that really could have happened back then. I mean, who knows? Like, maybe they succeeded and we just have not found out yet. Like, that's kind of my little dream. So I wanted to set it there, and then like for the I wanted to set the Homestead in the 70s, and then I felt like jumping ahead when Josie was in her 20s put us in the 90s, like in 94, which is sort of right. Like, I feel like it's a little bit cuspy, like right before maybe not necessarily cell phones would have been more commonplace, but like at least internet. Like, she probably could have accessed the internet a little bit if it had been even like 3 or 5 years later. So
you're so clever. Just set all your books in the 90s so you don't have to deal with the internet, which is like the plot writer's bane. Yeah.
Yeah, it made it a lot of fun. Although sometimes there were scenes where I had to put a lot of effort into figuring out something that I could have just figured out with like her picking up her phone and looking at it. So that was true. That was a little frustrating, but it made it fun. I hope it gave it like that kind of like, not, I always want to say old fashioned, which is ridiculous. I was like literally like a 10-year-old in 1994. I know it's not old fashioned, but it gives it more of that shape of like the road trip stories where they get to like use phone booths and like stop at old motels, and they have to like use these like big confusing atlases and road maps to figure out where everything is. I had a lot of fun writing that aspect of it.
I love that too. I was a teenager in 1994. I don't think I was driving quite yet. Maybe I just learned how to drive, but like, yeah, the road trip. I have very intense memories of road trips from that era, or just a little bit later. Um, okay, I have to stop and ask if there are questions from the audience. This is a good time to ask them because we've got like maybe 15 more minutes or a little bit more. So if you've got questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments and I will read them out loud. And otherwise, we'll just keep chatting because I feel like I can talk about this book forever. Yeah. Oh, God, there was another question in my mind right before I stopped and asked that question. But yeah, maybe just talk a little bit about your writing life in general and kind of how you came into publishing novels. You went to an MFA program? Is that something you had always intended to do? And were you there for fiction and knew what kind of thing you were going to write? Or did that come later?
I had always wanted to be a writer. I was one of those kids who was like, I was homeschooled and my mom was a pretty flexible teacher. She dabbled in even unschooling, which is like, for people who think homeschooling is like too hardcore, they're just like, we'll just unschool you. So I pretty much got to be self-directed, which was both good and bad. And my preferred method of learning was to just like read a lot, like just go to the library and come home with tons of books. So I always knew that I wanted to be a writer in that way because it was something that, helped me feel so connected and intrigued and excited that I wanted to kind of put those words into the world myself and hopefully have that effect on somebody else one day. The MFA program, I think after I graduated from undergrad, I think when I started undergrad, I wanted to be like a studio art major for a while.
Wow.
Yeah. And I like in the book I'm writing right now, the character is like a visual artist. So it's really fun to return to like that old dream of mine. But I kind of gave in and was like, you know what? Like, I know that I want to be an English major, like, for better or for worse. So I'm going to just go for it. And I toyed with the idea of not going to MFA programs. I think I may have taken like a year off and just applied to a lot of them. I was pretty young when I went, which is like slightly hilarious to me now when I think of myself as like a 23-year-old in an MFA program. I think in some ways I could have gotten more out of it if I had waited a little bit longer because I was kind of more hesitant. Like the idea of finishing a novel was so unthinkable to me, which I think it is, like it's still a little unthinkable to me even after finish novels. Every time I sit down to write one, I'm just like, this is like, I don't think this is something people can actually do. Like it seems so tricky when you're first sitting down to write a novel, or even like when you're in the middle of a novel, or when you only have one chapter left of a novel and then you have to revise. And, in my early 20s in the MFA program, there were people who had novels like when we graduated. Like I was definitely not one of them. I had to wait a little bit to land on the idea of my debut, The Possessions, and then actually finish it, which I almost feel like I finished that novel like out of spite in a way, because I was just like, I'm going to like show myself that I can. But I didn't have that same, it took me a little bit of time to like reach that point. I met so many amazing people in the MFA program that I'm like super, super grateful that they just let me hang out for like a couple of years and be around these people who are honestly probably way too cool for me. It was a lot of fun, but yeah, I don't think I was at the stage where I quite knew how to take the ideas in my head and translate them into like an actual manuscript that other people could pick up and read.
What do you think took you there from what changed?
That is a tricky question. I don't know if it was just I don't know if I just had to kind of get there on my own. I did start writing the possessions like right after I had my first child, which is a terrible, it was almost like this sense, like if I don't do it now, I was scared that I wouldn't be able to like do it in the future somehow. I had really bought into this idea that like being a mother would kind of take away everything else in my life, which I have come to like really question. I mean, that's a hugely complicated topic that I could talk about all day about like how parenthood affects you and how much support you get and how much support you need. But there was like, I really had bought into this fear that, you know, the way people talk about motherhood, they sometimes act as if it's going to inherently take away like your edge and your creativity. I remember asking my husband to like bring me some of Shirley Jackson's books when I had like my newborn, like her I can't remember exactly what they're called, but they're like collections of her essays that she wrote, because she had like she had 4 kids, which is like twice as many kids as I have even now. It feels like it feels like quite a few children for me personally. And
was it Life Among the Savages?
Yeah. And I think it was so inspiring to remind myself that Shirley Jackson is like, you know, like the queen of the creepy writers. Like she's so intense, so weird, like so distinct. And at the same time, she was like running around with 4 kids, like, you know, making them lunches and wiping their noses. And those 2 different roles didn't deplete each other. Like they could.
Yeah. I think, in fact, that they fed each other in some very interesting ways. I mean, it's like she has so many essays and short stories that deal with where domestic objects have like a life of their own. And she seems to, sometimes you can't even tell when she's writing these essays. She's very tongue in cheek and she's funny, but it's sometimes you really can't tell whether she's being kind of serious in her, like she says like the kitchen spoons talk to her, or she's, you know, she has like a relationship with these domestic tasks that make them almost feel like, you know, like it's magical. And she actually called herself a witch in some of these essays. And so, and I know it's like, but yeah, so I just was thinking of that in relation to your book and how you're, you know, and how motherhood, how much this book is about motherhood and about the powers of motherhood and daughterhood and sisterhood. And yeah, I think so. I think it's fascinating to me that you started writing after you had your, like when you had a newborn, because I got my first book out like just before, and and I was laughing. I don't know if my brain really is 100% what it was before. It's changed. We'll just say it's changed. But I was just going to point down to the chat box one more time and say, hey, anybody who has a question for Sara about her writing life or about Girl One or possessions or anything else, feel free to drop it in the comments. And otherwise I will just ask you my next question. It sounds like Shirley Jackson was a big influence on you, maybe even early in life. But yeah, what are some of the things, were your tastes always dark and supernatural and Gothic, or is that something that developed later in life? What were your kind of formative books when you were young in that genre?
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, I was raised Catholic in a slightly strange, like subdenomination, I guess, of Catholicism. So when I grew up, I had like a lot of very Gothic things in my life that I don't think I identified as Gothic yet. But, you know, I grew up like as a little kid, like, I mean, demons played like a pretty big role in like my understanding of the world, like demons, angels. There was just like, there was a lot going on. And I think that almost more than anything that I interacted with gave me this love of like things that are a little bit strange, or like this idea of a world that is kind of always with us, but is unseen, you know, but still has this very rich impact on who we are. I was not like the bravest of children. I came into horror very slowly. I remember watching like Sixth Sense when I was like 16, maybe. I want to say my dad had already spoiled it for me, which I still hold against him. He also spoiled Psycho for me, so I have I have two grudges that I always remind him of. But that movie scared me like so badly. I feel like I literally couldn't sleep for like days. It was a pretty rough experience. And who knows like why instead of saying, all right, that's it, never again. Because I do know people who get so scared and upset that they're just like, yep, like, no, I can't do it. I was like, yeah, like I'm gonna keep on trying this. Like maybe I can watch some other scary movies. Now, to be honest, I almost miss that because I feel like at this point, it has been so long since a movie has scared me badly enough to keep me awake for like even one night. And I'm almost like, that would be like so exciting. Hereditary came close, but not quite.
I agree. I agree. I was a little bit like, good first act, very scary moments. Then it just kind of was like, some good set pieces, but not scary. What about Babadook? Were you scared during Babadook? Tell me the Babadook scared you.
It scared me, but it mostly just made me like incredibly sad. And and that's the thing. Like I watched Sixth Sense when I was a grown-up, actually with my dad. Probably because I yelled at him about the spoiler before I watched it. And like we both ended up crying about it together.
It's really sad.
When I watched it the first time, it was just like bone chilling, like terrifying. Yeah. And then I watch it like 10 or 15 years later as a grown up and I'm like, oh man, like this is a very sad movie. So I feel like I've kind of shifted into seeing horror in a slightly more nuanced way, which is kind of sad because I miss that like adrenaline rush and that like stay up all night, but probably better for the storytelling and appreciating that part of it.
You know, we have a 3-year-old right now, and I was just talking with someone about our 3-year-olds and how they get so scared. My son actually can't handle anything loud or fast or any conflict really right now, and he'll hold his hands over his ears, even if it's like a small, like it doesn't have to be that loud, a picture of an explosion or whatever, and he'll be like, And I thought for a long time, like he couldn't handle it at all, and I'd be like, do you want me to turn this off? Like you're really stressed out. And then after a while, I think maybe at first he was, but then after a while I could see that he was like, no, I want to watch. This is just my way of handling it. It's like covering your eyes. And he was drawn to going back and seeing those same things, you know, that scared him. Like he'd become sort of obsessed with them and want to go back and see them again and again. And I think I think it must be hardwired. I think the love of horror and that kind of attraction response to things that scare us has got to be some kind of, you know, hardwired thing in us, because I think, you know, even children do it naturally. So I think it's totally normal to want to be scared and grossed out by horror movies. And I'm with you 100% on that.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I feel like we can stereotype like horror fans as like being very like unempathetic or very like edgy or what, I don't know, like trying too hard to be edgy. Every horror fan I've met so far that I've been lucky to meet has always been somebody who seems like very empathetic and very thoughtful. I think it can be a way to deal with anxiety because anxiety is so like it just is kind of free floating and difficult to control. And horror lets you like engage with it in like a controllable way, which is something that I appreciate about it now. I don't know, I always thought of it that way. And I mean, there also is like the, you know, just like the adrenaline or the fun too. But I think that's one of the reasons I keep coming back to it is because it can give me like a sense of control over like very, very big existential, uncontrollable fears.
Yeah, totally. I'm 100% with you. And that's why before we wrap up, because we're going to do that in just a second, even though Girl One is not a horror novel in any way, shape, or form. So please, people who are reading it, it's not actually scary and gross. It's scary in the suspenseful sense. It's like thrilling, and it's like creepy from time to time. But again, it's not, I wouldn't call it a horror. It has a little bit of that like chill factor, but it's really like by the end, it's just like the action beats are so tense that I really stayed up like late in the night reading it. So, but yeah, so what's your favorite horror movie? That's what I'm going to drop on you, and then we'll be like out.
That's really, really difficult. I don't know that it's like my top favorite, but one recent one that I loved so much was It Follows. Because it is so, I feel like it has so much there, like that no one can quite figure out exactly what the metaphor is or what it stands for, but like there's so many rich, cool theories. And it's also just honestly visually beautiful and
it is
incredibly, incredibly scary. Like truly, to me at least, I like still think about it when I'm out on a walk or something. I'm just like, oh no, I'm thinking of It Follows again. So that's like a very recent one, and by a newer director, I think, that I just love.
Yay! Well, guys, this is your last chance. Put it in the comments. Speak now or forever hold your peace. But otherwise, I'm just going to say thank you so much, Sara, for just inviting me to think about and talk about this book. It's going to stick with me like It Follows stuck with you, and for a long time, and I might even think about it in the middle of the night. And I just can't recommend it enough for anyone who hasn't had a chance. Please get it. The buy link is right down there below the thing. It says buy the book, and you'll be supporting Women and Children First, which again is one of the last remaining feminist bookstores in the country. So thank you so much. Also, Kaylee and Women and Children First. This has just been such a lovely time. And Sara, huge congratulations. Can we give Sara in the comments just a little shout out and clapping to let her know that we appreciate her and we're so excited about Girl One. Yay!
Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. I've been looking forward to this talk with you for a long time now, ever since I learned that I would be able to do it, and it's been absolutely amazing, and I'm so grateful to you.
Cheers.
Thanks so much, everyone. Congratulations, Sara. Wonderful discussion and evening. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.